When you select a piece of land, there are some key factors you need to understand when choosing a home site. These factors are impacted by local zoning, they're impacted by your preferences and needs, and I'm going to share them here in kind of a checklist format. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead, where we help landowners and individuals who are developing land for a homestead or a small farm get the very most out of their land. See, land, they aren't making any more of it, and we always find land owned by somebody. And so when you get a piece of land, it may not be perfect for your intended dream or purposes, but we can modify that land in a way that is both ecologically friendly, that kind of amplifies the value of that land already, as well as our fits our needs for a homestead. Now the big challenge is a lot of people will go in and put a lot of time and effort changing a piece of land into their ideal perspective without understanding the dynamics of the land, and then they end up with erosion problems, they end up with access problems, they end up with a lot of different frustrations. Now, you may know from previous podcast episodes that I've shared some historical homestead or farm designs that tend to work in most climates, and it tends to work in a way that provides you adequate shelter for animals, heating and cooling of the buildings, a secure courtyard, for example, that you can work on different things or bring in harvests without having to worry about predation. Smaller animals can be maintained closer. Those things are very important. And we're just going to assume that you have a rectangle that is the footprint of your home or your courtyard. Now, when we apply that to a piece of land, what I really want you to do is go to your county's GIS system. Now, by the way, you don't have to own a piece of land to do this exercise. You can think about your ideal piece of land or anything that's basically 5 acres or greater, and you can build this rectangular template to place on the piece of land. Now, when you print out the map from the your county's GIS system, which is a global information system, you can go in and put the address of the property you're looking at, and then you can apply this template over top of that piece of land. Now, I say rectangle because a, when you print it out of the printer, it's on a rectangle, it's on a piece of paper. And then a rectangle can be oriented north or south. Um, it has some kind of top and bottom orientation, but ultimately, when it's implemented, it could be the round on top of a plateau. It could be a crescent or half circle on the back of a hill or the front of a hill. Just really depends on your climate. But the key is this rectangle is going to contain your core home, animals, small livestock, basically your zone one. It's going to be the construction core of zone one. And the reason why we do this, and you may not be aware, but I've stood up in front of planning commissions, is they're going to want a plan that makes sense to them. So if you go up there and you explain to them that you're going to have these organic lines and you're doing an English natural garden, and some of the garden areas will have wildflowers that could be as tall as hip high, or you might be using grains that could be as tall as a person, like sorghum, for example, could be 6 feet tall, they may get confused. Or you may have the problem with the NIMBY folks that not in my backyard. And so if you're relying on zoning to change, you must present something that looks like what other people expect their home to look like. Not what they expect the farm to look like, not what they expect the homestead to look like. You know, a lot of people, if you ask them about homesteads, they expect to see like preppers and guns and broken down vehicles. And if you think permaculture homestead, you're thinking about old hippie buses and people walking around half naked because they got outdoor showers. And all this may be true, but it's not what's going to get you approval with zoning so that you can start building on your property. Now, it depends on where you're from. In a northeastern area of the United States, you say homestead, they might think of more of a colonial homestead, which is a small house with a picket fence. But if you're down in the south, that could be a homestead, as in a really 2 or 3 mile long road going out to an isolated location with Cotton Eye Joe sitting out on the front porch with a shotgun. Anyway, The reason we choose the rectangular format is because it's easy to represent on paper, but do understand that you may have, depending on the contours of the area, different organic lines. You may not want a straight driveway because of the line of sight of your home in a road, for example, and you may ultimately have animal needs that are more. Uh, so here's something that's hard for people to understand. If you're building a homestead for you, and horse people understand this easily, but if you're building a homestead for you, very often people start the planning with what they want. But if you're producing a homestead that's going to have livestock, very often you start with what the livestock's going to want. So where are your pastures? Where are your paddocks? And it's not always where the previous farmer had them. Or if you're developing new land, like in the case of the property that I show in a lot of our videos, that we actually put trails in place because we have an idea where the paddocks will be, but right now there's 12-foot tall trees and scrub brush underneath that. And so we created paths with the forest mulcher. My key point is before you spend a dime on the property itself, is to print out a piece of paper that's going to have your contour lines on it, and it's going to clearly show your property boundaries. You're going to highlight the property boundaries with a marker so they're nice and rich and colorful, and then you're going to photocopy that. And then you're going to take a photocopy picture and you're going to draw your homestead on it. It doesn't cost you anything other than a piece of paper and a pencil to draw out what you want in a homestead. Now, depending on the layout, some people are going to have buildings spread apart and some people are going to have the buildings close together. My philosophy is a compound. My philosophy is throughout nature, Japanese culture, for example, they're going to have a large main building or main hall. A lot of Asian cultures do this. They have a main hall. Then they're going to have a side building for processing and storage. And they're going to have another side building for guests. The courtyard in the middle is going to be sized according to the plot, but it's going to give them a space for their zone 1 gardens, so their herb gardens, their leafy green vegetables, and then outside the compound walls will be their broad acre crops in zone 2, maybe even orchards. And so it's a compact design because I'm not there for spreading out on the land. I'm there for a convenience and utility of the property so that we can get the most natural growth and scape. And ideally, I'm going to have a zone 5. Zone 5 is you're going to be your forests and your outer areas. I'm going to have chunks of those all over the place so that we have plenty of pathways for our wildlife. But again, you can take that printout and start drawing on the map. Now we can inform what we draw on the map. And just like when I do a consultation with a client, you're going to pull up Google Maps or some kind of map that has aerial photographs. Now, when I did this 10, 15 years ago, there were not the aerial photographs. You had to order them from a special service. But ultimately, today on the computer, we can get on a webinar or a Zoom call and we can go through the satellite images of your property and then start laying out buildings and things. But again, we haven't decided on the building until we've decided on the footprint. So a piece of property I'm working with today, it has a 120-foot by 240-foot footprint for the compound. Now, again, it's not we're not building Osama bin Laden's compound. We got walls and guards and stuff. What I'm talking about is the footprint of your zone 1 and the maximum area that we're going to develop in the first year or two because it's the intense cultivation area. And so for an estate house that's in a community, that could be the house is set back at the end of that rectangle, and then there's a large circular driveway in the middle, and then down each side you might have rose gardens or other types of herb gardens, and then behind the house you may have your larger vegetable garden. If you were going to set up in an urban space, you may have actual compound walls, but inside of that compound space, you may be parking on the street, but you may have a gate that comes in and then a garden area in front of the house because the backyard is very small. If you're in a London town or a English suburb, you might live in a townhouse and then the backyard is a long rectangle and you're going to basically plan that out as a market garden, and then your larger crops might be on an allotment someplace away from your main house. Do you see what I'm talking about here? You want that general design, that general footprint, and then we're going to figure out where we put it on the property. Now, a lot of times what happens is someone will put the rectangle there, and now we've got to answer the question is how do we get to that space? So if you have a large piece of property and your ideal location, so when you put a home site in, you want it not to be on the top of a large hill because you're going to have wind problems. You don't want it to be at the bottom in the valley because you're going to have some different kind of wind problem. You may not want to have it on a slope because you're going to have. Do you see what I'm saying here? You got to find a location that you can get to and a location that is easy to manage, and then it's going to have some climate and solar aspect characteristics. If we do this on paper, then you can figure all that stuff out, and if there's a mistake, you get another copy and just draw another picture. It's really not that difficult. The real problem comes is when you own a piece of property and you start bulldozing a road in, or you might footprint where someone else has had a home because that's where they put their home. Why not you put it there? Not understanding the solar aspect, not understanding the accessibility of your zone zero, not understanding that now if you have a house out in the middle of the woods, that you have a higher level of predation. There's one gentleman who visited their property. He had like a 14-foot fence around his entire 5 acres, which is wonderful. His gardens were incredible. The flower beds were out in the open and beautiful. The fruit trees were incredible looking. Deer and large animals could not get into that property. He never had to worry about a bear in his front yard or a deer in his garden. However, the chicken coop was downslope from the property, more towards the front gate. It was a good, 200 yards from the house, and raccoons just climbed this giant fence and will eat all of his chickens before he'd even know there was a problem. And so, having that chicken coop closer to the house is going to increase the frequency in which you're going to keep it clean. Also, it's going to simplify the access for eggs and such. And it's also going to give you a manure resource that is closer to market gardens. So he was actually changing his design a little bit to have a larger garden around the chicken area, which would have gave him two barriers to access that would be more suitable for keeping out possums, raccoons, and snakes. And then, of course, this was an adaptation through a lesson. But again, if we plan these things out in advance, you're going to have a better opportunity of having your right homestead. Now, I did mention earlier in this zoning and planning, there are going to be offsets to the property line in every jurisdiction. So, yes, you're going to go to the GIS and get that big old map. You're going to think about the rectangle or the footprint of your homestead or your core buildings in your zone one, but then you're also going to start looking at the ordinance. Some agricultural land around here can't have anything that's taller than 75 feet up in the air. So if you've got a large piece of property, 100, 200 acre piece of property, and you want to put a radio system in place so that you can communicate with people while they're out on the property, maybe you're running cattle, maybe you're running livestock that are going to migrate through the land, that tower can't be taller than a certain amount of thing. You have to get a special ordinance for it. Now, if you're going to do a building that is going to be higher than it is going to be wide, some places have restrictions on the square footage. Especially in the case, I recently was talking to Planning Council. We had to get the property agriculturally zoned because this particular client was going to have a house that was smaller square foot than their outbuilding. So the outbuilding was going to have a workshop, a place to work on vehicles, animal shelter, proper livestock housing. It would have actually been a greater square footage than their home, and that was not presented in the not acceptable to the zoning in their previous setup. So a lot of times people run into trouble when they don't understand the zoning. I've had the problem myself. I've gotten legal advice. I understand what zoning was, and then even the interpretation of the zoning was different than the actual zoning, and it would have just been easier to be on agricultural land in the beginning. But again, don't let that stop you. You're going to take all these inputs, plan them on paper, and then ultimately go out for a survey. Now, let's say you've got it planned on paper. It is always easier to survey with stakes than it is to start construction and not have so we talk about incrementally constructing your buildings and locations, but we're building that from a plan. And so you can actually start staking out your plan to see whether or not it works for the environment. It is entirely possible that the perfect site for your home has several hundred feet of rock underneath it, so you're not going to be able to build your home there. Or it could be sandy soil, it could be something different. So the last part of today's podcast, I want to make sure you understand is that once you have it on paper, I want you to get out there and with some survey stakes and just start outlining that rectangle, outlining that key footprint. And it's going to start helping you see how the land works. It's better than cutting down all the trees and trying to figure it out later. Um, the conventional way of establishing a residential home is to plow it all down and stamp a home down because of the convenience of the builder. When you have your own property, you can actually do it to the convenience of you, which would be to survey out the roads and access points, to identify water, to identify where existing structures are, to identify where new structures go. And ultimately, then you can start your perk test and other factors that are necessary to build within compliance of your local zoning. So if you get out there and you put stakes around your open areas, paint those stakes green. If you have stakes around roads, you're going to paint those orange. And then you may have stakes around areas where you're going to have water, and you're going to paint those blue stakes. Again, $100 in stakes is better than thousands of dollars in equipment on site when you don't have everything kind of fleshed out. Now, there are going to be factors, and we can talk about these in more details with a specific consultation, but there are going to be factors where you can't have a pond near a house with a basement because there's going to be what's called water lensing. And then you also have to be mindful of your water tables. So you may choose a home site, get these stakes out there, and then when they come to a perk test, you might find out that the water table is too high. Great thing about this particular method that I'm looking at here, or that I'm describing to you here, is that you could just pull those stakes out of the ground and go put them someplace else. You haven't put out a lot of money. You can do this even before you own the land. Not necessarily putting the stakes out, but even before you own the land, you can print out a map of the land, look at aerials, and kind of figure out what you want to do with the land. And there will be times where what you want to do is not going to work for that piece of land. The good news is you haven't put a lot of money in up front, and that saves you more money for your down payment. It saves you more money for education rather than the expense of experience. And then ultimately, you can get out there, get those stakes in place, and it's meaningful to the contractors. They'll come in and they'll know where the foundation needs to go. Now, in another podcast, we can talk about working with builders rather than trying to do it all on your own. We can talk about what the builder is going to expect or what your contractors will expect, as I have a whole program on managing land projects. Many of my subscribers are working full time and they're ready to pull the trigger on their dream, but they're not in a position to do all the work themselves because they are occupied full time. So we want to be able to make the most of our income. We want to make the most of our planning and design, and we want to make sure that the homestead is ready when you're ready, even if you can't enjoy it today. So the last point I want to leave you with is there is nothing wrong with staking out so you found the perfect piece of property. You've got the design on paper. You've gone and staked it out. There's nothing wrong with going out there and camping on that land for a few years before you commit to a design. And this is what's the most exciting and wonderful thing, and why I talk about family camping all the time, is that your piece of land can be day one ready to experience, ready to enjoy, and ready to explore. And it's just a matter of how we approach design rather than where a lot of commercial interests will come in and just plow everything flat and stamp a house down and then they leave. We want to live with nature, engaging with the environment, and do so in a way that is productive for our families, productive for food security, productive for physical security, because physical security is important. I told you the story about the chickens. You lose 50 chickens, it's not a good day. So their physical security is important. And then ultimately to create that abundance with your family homestead, your family farm, your legacy of experience and enjoyment. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. I hope you'll join me at www.prosperityhomestead.org, where you can get more resources and information. We have past podcast episodes, and ultimately, we have the tools that you'll need to live that dream you want. We help property owners get more from their small farms, homesteads, or estates, and we help you do it with less work, less expensive experience and more abundance. I want to thank you for listening. Again, I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead.